Awesome. Okay, so apologies, I am a bit sick today. So if I have to pause and just like cough, just excuse that, but it shouldn't really affect what we're going to be talking about today. And we should be within the time limit as well. So I'm Jen, and today I'll be your host for the essay writing workshop. And it'll be a comprehensive guide into you guys making the adjustment from, I'm assuming, like junior essays, so like year 9, year 10, even year 11, to like what teachers are going to be expecting of you in year 12 and how to get those like high band 6 essays. Awesome. So a little bit about me. I'm currently in my second year of university. I'm studying a Bachelor of Commerce at the University of Sydney. In high school, I actually did extension English, and in both advanced and extension, I got a band 6. So I did quite well, and I can assure you that in junior years, I actually really struggled with essay writing. And it was only until like just after my last term in year 11, I was like, okay, I really need to put my head down, and I need to figure out how I'm going to tackle essay writing, because it was one of my weak spots. And then I found that, you know, the more that you practice, the more that you really find the skills that you like, that really find the areas of essay writing that you struggle with and target that and really build on your skills, the easier it will get. A little bit more about myself. I really like photography. I really like reading, hence like my love for English. And I'm also a really big fan of cats. Okay, so for everyone who's just joined, we're just getting started now, so you're all good. But today we're going to be talking about 4 main areas of discussion. So number 1 being what's the difference between junior and senior essays. And then we're going to be talking about how to ace upcoming in-class essay exams, because I find that a lot of students actually are really good at writing essays when they get some time to do it at home. But the second that they've walked into an exam room and they have only 40 minutes to complete it, that's when it becomes a little bit troublesome. From then, we'll move on to how to make writing easy with a custom essay template that I actually swore by during HSC. And once you really like break down each section of the essay into like even just like what sentence needs to be written after the next sentence, it becomes a whole lot easier. And lastly, I know probably most of you guys are victims to procrastination. I was 100% when I was doing my HSC, when I was in year 11, when I was in year 10, whatever, I was a big procrastinator. And I found that these tips really helped me prepare for when I was slacking, and still helps me pull through with some like decent marks. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to start with the difference between junior and senior essays. Now, you might not think that there's a big difference, and to be fair, the differences are quite incremental between like a junior and a senior essay, but it's those little things that really distinguish someone who has a really basic understanding of essay writing to quite an advanced and a strong like skill set when it comes to writing essays. Now, there are 3 main things that I want to talk about, and obviously there are going to be more. So as you're going, if there's anything that you think of as well, feel free to like wave a hand, and I'll be extremely happy for you to give me some input. Now, does everyone know, just do like a thumbs up if you guys are familiar with what a rubric is? Yeah? No? Cool. I see Olivia saying yeah. Anyone else? Anthony, yeah, Ethan, okay, awesome. So it's great that most of you guys are familiar with what a rubric is. And I'm going to tell you now, even if you don't think that rubrics are important, they are super, super important. And I say that because I know a lot of high school teachers actually just talk about the rubric for 5 seconds in that first intro lesson of the term, and then they never mention it again. Now, it's important to note, and I'm telling you, maybe you want to jot it down, a rubric that rubric, that description of the module you're studying, that's where all of your essay questions will come from. Okay, they cannot ask anything outside of what the rubric has said, basically. Okay, so if the rubric says, you know, human experiences, well, then that's what your essay question could potentially be. All right. Another thing is if the rubric doesn't say anything about context, which it never will, but let's say it never said anything about context, they cannot ask you an essay question about context. Okay, so learning the rubric essentially back to front will really aid you, because you can essentially write a practice essay that fits into the rubric and then really molds it well in your essay, in your exam. Okay, so we'll have a look at what the first rubric for HSC, like year 12 common module, is a bit later, but let's move on to the length of essays. Now, as much as I wished that HSC was online, it's not, and I'm a really slow writer, okay? And that was the main issue with my marks that were coming back to me, was because I was never finishing my essays on time. Now, I'm telling you this, that I'm saying that this is a big distinguisher between junior essays and senior essays, because it really is. That extra 200 words that you get to write in 10 minutes will be significantly more beneficial towards your marks than it will be if you were missing those 200 words, okay? So 100% aim for the 900 to 1,100 words in 40 to 45 minutes. Now, in HSC, in year 11 and year 12, most of like the time allocation is very similar to junior years. However, they're not very lenient with the word count. Okay, so if you're going into an exam and in 40 minutes you're only writing 700 words, you're going to lose marks. Okay, if you're only writing 700 words and let's say you had a conclusion that you didn't finish, you're going to lose marks. And I know it's like sometimes you weigh up the options. Will I finish a body? Will I finish a conclusion? At the end of the day, you need to be aiming to finish all of it, because if you don't finish it, that's a mark lost for structure. So when HSC markers are marking, when your teachers are looking at your working class, there are a few things that add up to what the 20 marks will be. So obviously it's like your evidence, the clarity and expression that you use throughout your essay, the relevance to the question, and structure, okay? So if you're not finishing a conclusion, you have not completed the structure of an essay, and therefore you cannot get the full marks for structure, okay? No matter how good your essay is going to be, right? So my English teacher in year 12 always said to me, quality and quantity is what matters in HSC, okay? It's not just about the quality of the work, but it's also about the quantity. So I would recommend that any chance that you really get to do practice essays or handwrite essays, go for it, okay? Make sure you are handwriting, because you can't type in HSC. Okay, now another show of hands if you guys are pretty comfortable or familiar with the idea of context. Put a thumbs up. Cool. Okay, so I only see that Olivia knows about context, so maybe we can go into it a little bit more. So context involves research into your study text beyond just what is in the book, okay? So consider the author's personal context and the time period it was written, okay? So by author's personal context, what does that mean? Okay, so let's say you're reading a poem and it's really sad and it's about like understanding mortality, and maybe this person's writing about their parent who had just passed away, okay? Perhaps in real life, that author went through an experience where their parent passed away, and therefore to deal with that grief, they're writing a poem, okay? So that could be an author's personal context, right? Maybe it's the fact that they lived through World War I, okay? And a lot of their work is inspired by World War I, okay? Another area of context, which is what most people focus on, is the actual time period it was written. So we have in literature, at least, we have different not genres, but we have different time periods in which books are released. So we've got like the postmodern, we've got post-World War I, post-World War II, we've got Elizabethan, which fits into like Regency, England, and things like that, like England back in the 1700s per se. And all those things, they all had very different sets of beliefs. So, for example, in the 1800s, there was a strong shift away from religion and into scientific discovery, right? So a lot of works around that time actually spoke about that. For example, if you guys have ever heard of Frankenstein or like Frankenstein or Dracula, those books are both in that era and therefore talk about like a new scientific discovery, i.e. Frankenstein or Dracula, that shift away from religion, okay? If we look at books that were written right after World War II, there's a big emphasis on the dangers of living in a really controlling government. So those are all things that you need to consider when you're learning your texts in class, because it's what distinguishes a junior essay, which never talks about context, to a senior essay, which has a strong emphasis on context. Awesome. Any questions so far? Okay, perfect. Let's move on. So this is the rubric from Year 12 Text and Human Experiences, which is the common module for Year 12. If you guys, I'm pretty sure you guys are mainly in Year 11 and Year 10. So this is what you'll be seeing either next year or the year after, okay? It's not too difficult. So we're just going to have a look at the first paragraph. This is just 2 paragraphs from like a 4-paragraph rubric. And let's have a look at what they're asking, essentially, okay? So it says, in this common module, students deepen their understanding of how texts, and then look at the highlighted part, represent individual and collective human experiences, okay? So that's the crux of the module, okay? So if you know that sentence, all right, you know what the module is going to be about. It has to be about human qualities, human emotions, and anything that's associated or arising from these experiences, okay? Now, if you look at the second paragraph, it says, text may give insight into the anomalies, paradoxes, and inconsistencies in human behavior and motivations. Okay, so those words you would want to use throughout your essay response. Okay, that is how you are tackling, i.e. the whole idea of the module, okay, relating it to the text you have studied in class, and therefore it's showing me, the marker, that you actually have a really strong understanding of what you learned throughout the term, okay? Now, you can see that they use a lot of descriptive words. So anomalies, paradoxes, inconsistencies, or like adjectives as well. And they specifically say, see the world differently, to challenge assumptions and ignite new ideas or reflect personally. So all these things are what the question can ask, what the question of the essay can ask you to do, okay? So for example, a question may be, how does your prescribed text challenge you to see the world differently and reflect on new ideas? Okay. The second part of the question could be, consider how your prescribed text has illuminated both individual and collective human experiences. All right. So the way that I would tackle it is each paragraph, I'm going to have to bring up a new idea into how we see the world differently and how it helps me reflect. Okay, so that's just one simple way of jumping into how you might tackle a question using your understanding of the rubric. And it really just emphasizes how the rubric is absolutely vital in understanding what you're going to be learning about and therefore acing your essays. Okay, any questions so far? Oh, good. Okay. So now we're going to go to the next segment of the workshop, and let's actually talk about how we actually can move our marks per se from being in like the C range, the B range, or even the A range to like the top A ranges, okay? So there are 4 things that I want to specifically talk about, and we have just discussed it earlier, but we're just going to hone in on it a bit more. So first of all, understanding your module, which is understanding the rubric, okay? Number 2 is staying up to date with class content, which I see as probably the most important, okay? So I see that as the most important out of all of the points I'm going to talk about, specifically for the fact that if you are leaving things to the last minute, there is no way that you can provide or produce a piece of work that is in depth enough to show me, the marker, that you have actually understood the module, okay? We'll go into that a little bit more. So I personally think that when it comes to writing an essay, that it's not about how many essays you write or how many hours you spend perfecting that one essay, but really about the level of preparation you have with quotes, analysis, context, ideas even, that you have actually synthesized into maybe like a document or a little mind map, something like that, just so it's you're doing the work throughout the term rather than just towards the end, okay? So during HSC, I personally would have a good quote bank. So as I was analyzing my working class, I would, chapter by chapter of the book, I would make a quote bank and I would add the technique that the technique within the quote, and I would just do 2 or 3 sentences of analyzing it, which only took me maybe like 5 minutes, okay? Now, by doing that, you have already done half your essay, because what makes up half the essay? It's your evidence, okay? So when it finally came around to me having to write an essay, I'll just refer back to my quote bank, pick the ones that I liked and use that analysis that I had already written, and obviously zhuzh it up a bit, make it sound a bit better, but it was already there for me, okay? So I would 100% recommend that you guys should get a quote bank ready. Do it however you want. Even if you haven't started doing it now, 100% you should start as soon as you can. Even if quote banks don't work for you, doing like little mind map summaries of each chapter is really, really helpful. And I found that that was the way it stayed in my mind the best, because I was a very visual learner. Okay, now we have also spoken about context. And context, we said that it differentiates a junior essay to a senior essay. Now, context, you will have your teachers telling you the context of the novel that you're studying, the poem that you're studying, whatever. However, it's important that you don't let it just go over your head, and you actually try your best to go in and see where you can actually do some extra research into context. Now, I'm saying this now because context is actually quite difficult to get your head around. I'll be completely honest. And the more that you read about it and the more that you understand it, the easier it will be to convey in a few sentences in your essay, right? Because we spoke about it. You know, you only have 45 minutes to write an essay, and max, let's say the average word count is going to be around 1,000. Now, you may think that 1,000 is a lot, but in actuality, it's not that much, okay? Let's say you're doing 300 words per paragraph and you have 3. That only leaves around 100 for the intro and the conclusion, okay? So including context, it can't be a hefty, like 5 lines of context. You need to be able to explain your context and embed your context very succinctly, just so your marker can get like a well-rounded understanding of what direction you're going into with your essay, okay? So I can 100% give you some examples into how you might want to include context, but doing that extra research, having a doc for your prescribed text and saying prescribed text, context, and just having like a whole page full of context is really useful. And I can assure you, a lot of context doubles up. So doing research now will probably aid you in future years as well, because you can reuse that context, that understanding that you have of context. And also, if anyone's doing history, modern history, ancient history, you guys are really lucky because context and modern history kind of relate to each other. Okay. Now, this is the last thing which I find to be really, really important, and actually a huge bummer when students miss it, because it can move your essay from being a 17 or a 16 per se into the A range of moving up to a 17 or even an 18. Okay, so this is essay or understanding essay questions and their verbs. Now, does anyone know what I'm getting at when I say understanding essay questions and their verbs? Like, you can shoot me a message, you can put your thumbs up, you can unmute yourself and you can talk if you'd like. But yeah, what does an essay verb mean to you? Oh, good. I think everyone's a little bit shy. Oh, good. So an essay question will always start or have a verb. Okay. So let's say essay question started with evaluate. Okay. Or to what extent even. Okay. So that is an action. Evaluate, to evaluate something, that's a verb, right? So if an essay question asks you to evaluate something, you need to give a judgment. Okay. So it's not uncommon that you get an evaluate or to an extent question. So understanding how you are going to tackle that sort of question is very, very important. So evaluate means to make a judgment. So therefore, at the end of your conclusion or in your conclusion or in your introduction, you need to say your opinion. Okay. You might want to write it in third person or you might want to write it in first person. That's completely up to you. But if it says, to what extent does this statement align to your understanding of your prescribed text? The keyword your means that you are allowed to say, and thus my understanding of this prescribed text aligns greatly to the statement. Okay. Obviously, go more into depth with that. And you don't need to constantly be saying, therefore I, or this statement aligns greatly to my understanding. You don't need to constantly say it, but putting it in there maybe once or twice is actually really beneficial and is what will actually distinguish you from getting 1 mark more or 1 mark less. Okay. So remember, keywords evaluate and to what extent you must give a judgment. Okay. If it just asks you to explain, okay, it's completely fine. You don't need to put that judgment in, but really understanding those verbs is important. Okay. Awesome. Okay. So now we're going to go into a step-by-step to essay writing. So it's kind of like almost like a cheat sheet that you should memorize and follow. And I found that this step-by-step was almost like helping me write my essays from what took like usually 5 hours to honestly like an hour and a half max. Okay. So this will probably take the most chunk of time in this, sorry, excuse me, will probably take the most chunk of time in this workshop. So I would recommend that you guys get some pen and paper out and just start jotting down what I say, because I'm pretty sure that you guys will probably use this and it's quite helpful. Awesome. So let's have a look at introductions. Now, I find as an English tutor that students tend to neglect their intros and their conclusions. Okay. However, first impressions matter. Okay. And an intro should be at least one of the strongest paragraphs or the strongest parts of your essay to make a really good first impression on the marker and really clearly establish to the marker what you'll be talking about in your body paragraphs. Okay. So let's start at the thesis statement. I'm sure all of you know what a thesis statement is, but just as a reminder, a thesis statement is the central argument of your essay, okay? A lot of the time, thesis statements also address the question and answer the question, but it's okay to have your thesis statement and then in the next question, address and answer the question. Now, developing a really solid thesis is not easy, okay? Because it's hard to condense an argument that holistically captures all of the new insights you're bringing in each body, okay? So I find that maybe spending some good quality time developing your thesis and understanding your thesis and then working with your topic sentences is a whole lot better than writing your paragraphs and trying to formulate a thesis statement afterwards, okay? A thesis statement shouldn't be too long. I don't want to read something and have it drag out like a really long sentence where I can't breathe, essentially, all right? So definitely consider the length of your thesis statement, the quality, so whether it's what language have I used, okay? If you're trying to answer the question, have I answered the question? What type of tone am I taking on with my essay, thesis statement, okay? And does it fit into the rest of the essay, okay? That's the main thing. Now is a thematic framework. This is the majority of your introduction. And as you move on into year 11 and year 12, you'll find that your conclusions go from being like this big to like maybe even like a whole page, half a page, okay? When I was in year 12, my introductions took up that first like 3/4 of a page when I was writing in booklets. So anywhere between like 150 to 250 words, okay? But it doesn't need to be that long. In the thematic framework, it's your job to summarize the insights / themes / ideas that you will be discussing in your body paragraphs, okay? So it's not just enough to be like, firstly, I will say this. Next, I will say this, and this. And then after that, I will conclude with this, and this, okay? It's really not ideal in year 12 to be listing, okay? So think of a way to thoughtfully integrate your ideas into 2 sentences instead of 3, okay? So perhaps if you've got 2 paragraphs that both talk about oppression, but talk about oppression in different ways. So maybe it's oppression of freedom, and then another one is oppression of women. You might want to integrate it. So it's like, well, in this body paragraph, I talk about oppression of freedoms, and then I further discuss this through, or this is further replicated, or this is further seen through the oppression of women, okay? Because of the patriarchy, something like that. So find points of connection that you are able to basically link one idea to another to show that your essay has synthesis, right? So a lot of the time students are writing essays, and honestly, it feels like 3 separate essays because there's no synthesis throughout. Synthesis just basically means connection between one paragraph to the next. So perhaps you might want to throw in like, oh, similarly every now and then, or like you might want to say mirroring this idea, so-and-so has said this, okay? So thinking about ways to integrate ideas thoughtfully together is what distinguishes like a B range, C range even to an A range, okay? And lastly, there's the linking statement. And it's important always to link back to the question and the module, okay? So that is saying like the rubric essentially. Make sure you have answered the essay question. If you read back your intro and you see that you have not addressed the question at all, well, you've done it wrong, okay? So think about ways you might want to actually answer the question and add thoughtful insight, okay? So it's not just enough to repeat the words of the question and be like, yep, I've referred to the question. That's not good, right? So think about what insight can I bring into the question, All right. So if the question's asking you, how does your prescribed text provide readers with greater insight or new perspectives into life per se, or human experiences? Okay. You need to say what insights. You can't just say, and therefore my prescribed text or the Merchant of Venice provides new insights into the human experience. That's just repeating the question. That's not answering the question. That's just repeating the question. So make sure you are adding what insights that you have gained from your prescribed text. Okay. Cool. So let's have a look at this example introduction, which is the Merchant of Venice, which I'm sure a few of you will end up doing in Year 12. And it's a HSC common module, which is the same rubric we read for text and human experiences. So you don't need to understand what's going on, but I just want you to be able to distinguish the three sections of the intro essentially that are in this sample. Okay, so I want you to see exactly where the thesis statement is, where the thematic framework is, and where the linking statement is. So let's have a look at the start. Okay, so they're referring to the module rubric, the human experience. Okay, and they're adding a little bit of an answer to what I presume the question would have been, what or how is the human experience defined? Something like that. All right. So they start off with answering the question, addressing the module about how it's actually very subjective what the human experience is. Okay, cool. That's brownie points for answering the question. Now they've moved on to their thesis. Okay, so it provides greater insight into the multifaceted nature of individual and collective human emotion and motivation. All right. Cool. So their whole essay is going to talk about the multifaceted nature of individual and collective human emotion and motivation, right? So they're going to talk about how it's complex, how it's confusing, how people are oxymoronic, how people are hypocritical, I'm assuming. And we'll see that in their thematic framework. So you'll see that this introduction doesn't actually list their ideas. They kind of discuss it freely, all right? They let one idea flow onto the next. So the stifled interactions between opposing religious groups explore the paradox of religion with the Christians' collective prejudice that regress their own moral integrity. Now, they've used their first idea, okay? Awesome. Then they use a point of connection using the word similarly, all right? And they continue to talk about oppression, all right? But in a different way. So now they talk about how it's brought forth by the patriarchy towards women, okay? And that relates back, all right? Because they talk about how it motivates people for revenge, which links back to their thesis statement of how motivation is confusing and complex, okay? Again, referring back to the rubric through collective experience to one that is individual, right? But they've added new insight. Here, they've said that collective and individual experiences are actually linked to one another, right? So that's just a simple way of linking your ideas, your body paragraph ideas together without listing them, okay? How you would have when you were in junior years. Finally, this is their last concluding statement. Through analyzing these interactions, the illumination of negative human experiences are subtly addressed, confronting audiences to question and better understand the complexity of the human condition. So again, they've gone back to the module. They probably could have done a better job at answering the question, but that's fine. And they have spoken about how their ideas relate to this last concluding statement. Okay, so if we look at the body of the essay now, we know that this is what makes up like 70-80% of our essay, right? So you have to have three body paragraphs, but you'll find that in year 12, there is one module where you are allowed to either have 2 body essays, body paragraphs, or 4 body paragraphs. But you don't need to worry too much about that now. Let's just focus on having 3. So the body is actually very similar to the introduction. There's an intro sentence, there's the middle part, and then there's a linking statement. Okay? Now, topic sentence, thesis statement. Same, but different in this context, okay? So thesis statement for me is the overarching argument that your essay is going to address, talk about, okay? Topic sentence is specific to the idea in your body paragraph, which ultimately is like this little sister or little brother to the thesis statement. Your topic sentence introduces the argument for your body paragraph, and it must present a key idea that connects to both the thesis and the essay question, right? Again, if you have not answered the question within at least 2 or 3 sentences of the body paragraph, you have done it wrong, okay? You need to answer the question. It's not enough to just answer the question at the end of the paragraph, because it shows that you don't have a strong depth. It just shows that you've regurgitated an essay that you've memorized at home, okay? That being said, try to integrate answering the question throughout the body paragraph. So perhaps after a quote analysis, something like that. Now, evidence, simple, very similar to junior years. Use whatever your school taught you, peel, teal, petal, whatever. And this is essentially where you back up your topic sentence, okay? So it's you proving and validating your points. You might want to include context in these areas now. So perhaps if a certain context that you studied in class or did in your own time relates really well to perhaps the topic sentence in this paragraph, 100% use it. It'd be a loss if you didn't, okay? So let's say you're talking about religion. Let's say you're talking about religion in your paragraph, okay? Perhaps you could talk about context about why was he writing about religion? You know, he's writing about religion because he lived in a time that was really religious. And therefore, you are backing up the point that this person that you've studied in class, this text that you've studied in class, 100% they are talking about religion because they lived in a time period where religion was a big deal. So if you just look over here, a quote bank will make analyzing quicker and easier. Like I said, just go refer back to the quote bank that you would have already made and copy and paste the exact quotes that you have found earlier in the year into your essay, okay? And just change the analysis so it's a bit more formal, a lot more detailed, and in relation to the question. It's important to note that in an essay, it shouldn't be taking you 5-6 hours to write one essay, okay? I have always been a firm believer that if it's taking you like 6-7 hours to write an essay over a period of a week, you're doing too much, okay? If you follow this framework, okay, if you know that the first thing I need to talk about is a topic sentence, and then the next part is going to be context, and the next part is going to be my evidence, there's no way for you to just forget what's going to happen next, right? Well, forget what you have to write next. So keeping in mind that evidence is the easiest part, really. And it's the easiest part because you don't have to make up your evidence. You have to validate your topic sentence using evidence, but the evidence is already in the prescribed text that you studied, okay? And the analysis will be there too from when you studied it. And in a body, like 70% of your paragraph is going to be analysis and evidence, okay? Stick with 3 to 4 to 5 good quotes. Think of creative ways to integrate your quotes. You might not always want to say evident in the quote, ... You might want to say, you might want to integrate it into like the symbolism or the metaphor that Christopher, I'm just trying to think of a way to integrate it. So there's like ways where you can list the quote saying seen in this quote, or you can actually say Christopher says quote, ... Okay. This use of a passive aggressive tone alongside a metaphor highlights, ... So you can see there's different ways of integrating quotes and evidence. Play with it. Just sometimes use the seen in this so-and-so quote and also integrate it to make sure that your essay is not sounding like repetitive and so structured. Okay. Your essay needs to sound really synthesized and it needs to flow. Okay. And those things create flow. I can show you an example and we can go through it and maybe you can make sense of it a bit better once you've seen it in front of you. But let's finally just look at the linking statement before we move on to that. So the linking statement is similar to the introduction. It's just recapping that paragraph, relating it back to the question, rest of the essay, right? Simple. Okay, so let's have a look at this body paragraph from Emma, which is the module B in year 12, right? So it's the critical study, which is something that you guys in year 11 will 100% do next, or this upcoming term next week, okay? So it's just a really in-depth look into a certain text. So you can see here, those first 3 lines are the topic sentences, okay? The topic sentence. And it talks about how class systems ultimately dictate social obligations and interactions. Cool. So I know what the paragraph's going to be about. Now, they jump straight into the analysis and they jump straight into stylistic features such as unique narrative voice. You can see how this quote, this introduction of a quote doesn't say seen in the quote moderately genteel. Okay, they actually say the Coles are first introduced as moderately genteel. So it's actually embedded into the sentence rather than you introducing the quote and then having a separate sentence to analyze the quote. Again, this is a different way of them integrating a quote. They've said evident in the Coles were very respectable, ... And then they further analyze it. Okay. This is only half the paragraph. So think of this and more. But it's a good start to where you might want to head. Okay. So here they talk about context in a very subtle way. So they say Georgian. Okay. You don't need to constantly explain what the values of the Georgian era were. Maybe they did it in the introduction and then they weren't, well, they've done it in the topic sentence and maybe they did it in the introduction. So they don't need to constantly repeat the values of the time period or the context, okay? So they can just use things like Georgian, Elizabethan, Regency to compare these things. Again, they talk about the emphasis on social hierarchy, which is the main idea of the topic sentence, and therefore they must be getting at the question and the rubric, basically, okay? Does anyone have any questions before we move on to the conclusion? Okay, we'll continue. The conclusion, like I said earlier, students also tend to neglect quite a lot. Now, it's extremely, extremely, extremely important it's an extremely important part of the essay, right? Because first impressions are a really big thing, and lasting or the last impression is a really big thing as well, right? I don't want to read this awesome essay that starts off with a really strong intro, really great body paragraphs, and then be so disappointed by the conclusion, because that's the last thing I'm going to read. And that's probably the last thing and the most clear thing that I'm going to remember. It's fresh in my mind. Okay. So try your best to give yourself like a solid, I want to say like 5 minutes to write a conclusion. It doesn't need to be long. It just needs to be succinct, and it shouldn't just waft. Okay. Worst case scenario, just look at the introduction and try to rephrase what you said in the introduction. Never, never, never bring up new points in the conclusion, right? If you bring up new points in the conclusion, why couldn't you have done that in the bodies, right? Your marker will get annoyed, right? So just focus on restating the thesis that you established in your introduction, recapping your arguments, but more specifically, recapping the insight that you brought from your arguments, okay, from your topic sentences. And then a final statement that leaves a really good lasting impression to the marker, all right? Awesome. Now, if you look at this conclusion, it's not long, okay? And it's coming from HSC Module A, which you guys don't need to worry too much about, but they have really addressed their thesis, summed up their arguments really well, actually included a little bit of author context, and has a really strong lasting, like last linking statement that touches on the module and the question, right? So you don't always need to start your conclusion with "to conclude," right? Think of creative ways that you might want to start your introduction. So, for example, this introduction of started has begun with the intentional connections established by Hughes in the reimagination of Plath's Ariel provide greater insight between similar and contrasting perspectives of individuals based on their personal context and struggles. Now, for most of you, that's probably flying over your head because you haven't done the module yet. But for a little bit of context, Module A talks about how one text was written, certain time period, it was written first, and then a few years later or many years later, another author comes and they are inspired by that text, and therefore they write their own text inspired by that one. Okay, so Hughes actually, they've done a really good job at explaining that Hughes has reimagined Plath's Ariel, okay, to provide insight into how a person's personal experiences and struggles can affect things in their life, okay, or their work, all right? Here, they talk about the ideas in the arguments in the body paragraphs, but they don't just restate the topic sentences. They actually state the insight that they brought on from the paragraph, like the purpose of talking about that topic sentence in the paragraph, okay? So they talk about context in that regard, how one author was really tortured by her own mortality, and therefore this links back to the intro sentence of personal context and struggles. Again, they talk about the reframing and understanding, reframing of connections, truths, and understandings of suffering, that he reclaims autonomy and identity, which in the end, this is what the module was about. They've done quite a good job at honing into what they were talking about in their essay, okay? So you'll see the synthesis, especially in this conclusion, with the fact that it's not three separate ideas completely different from one another. Somehow they are connected through the idea of personal context and struggles. Okay, one paragraph is about mortality, another one is about adversity that the husband had, and another paragraph is about adversity that this person had with their father. Okay, so it's all talking about struggles, but in different contexts. Okay, and therefore each paragraph is still starkly different from one another, but connected through that idea of struggle and suffering. Okay, so think of ways that you might want to talk about your ideas that still have a point of connection to one another. Because at the end of the day, I don't want to be reading 3 separate essays when I look at your page. I want to be reading an essay that really flows well into one another. Okay, and that's an example of a conclusion that captures it. Okay. Awesome. So we're still on time. We're actually a little bit early. So now I'm going to be talking about last minute tips for in-class essay exams, because I know probably you guys are all victims to procrastination. Okay. Now, when I was in high school, I found that I actually would be like, oh, English is fine, not that big of a deal. I'm just going to memorize my quotes and then I'll just make up everything on the day. Okay. That is not the case in Year 12, right? Aside from memorizing your quotes, which obviously you have to do, you need to memorize certain parts of your essay in order for you to not be in the essay, not be in the exam and just forget and then be wasting 10 minutes trying to put together words. Okay. So I have a few tips that pulled me through that and helped me overcome procrastination when I had an essay coming up. And honestly, I think aside from that, it is really important for you guys to all start when you can. And just doing 10 minutes, even 15 minutes a night of English will make a world of difference compared to you just walking into an exam using the quotes that you've memorized the night before and just winging it. Okay. And in saying that, by no means does all of what helped me, it might not help you. Okay. But just take it, trial it, and see what does work and work with that. And you'll figure it out on the way. So what helped me get a band 6 was 50% understanding the content, right? There was never a lesson that I went into English where if I didn't understand something, I just walked out of the classroom. I made it my mission. If I didn't understand something, I'm going to go up to the teacher and I'm going to ask her. Okay. And most of the time it was about context. If I didn't understand context, I'd go up to my teacher and I'd ask her about it or him about it. And also when I didn't understand what the quote meant, because sometimes some quotes, especially if you're doing poems, they're really obscure. Okay. And if you're doing Shakespeare, half the time I don't understand what Shakespeare's saying because of the language he used. It's Old English. I don't understand Old English. Okay. So you should definitely use something called, for Shakespeare, No Fear Shakespeare. It's on SparkNotes, but it's just a modern day translation of the Shakespeare text. Okay. So it has the old text on one side and the modern text on the other side, and you just read it side by side, and it honestly makes the world of difference. Okay. Rather than you just looking at a Shakespeare book being like, I don't know what's going on. 30% of what helped me get a band 6 was practice essays and paragraphs. Now, you may think I'm not going to write 6-7 essays throughout the term to hand to my teacher before the exam, because that is quite difficult, right? And we don't always have time. But with the cheat sheet that we just went through, honestly, if you follow it, memorize it, and you follow, okay, I finished my thesis statement, I need to talk about context, and then I need to talk about my arguments, it will make writing essay a lot quicker, and therefore you can hand in more, okay? But there's always going to be students who hand in 8 essays every 2 weeks, okay? I had plenty of those kids at my school, but in the end, we ended up getting around the same mark, and some of them did a lot better, some of them did worse, okay? But it just goes to show that handing in essays, not handing essays, It is helpful, 100%. I will not tell you that it's not helpful, but it's not going to work for everyone. Okay. We don't always have that time. So as long as you're keeping a quote bank, I think that is the majority of where the differentiation between high mark students and lower mark students is having a quote bank, because having a quote bank is basically doing the work for you. Okay. Basically writing the essay for yourself. Writing practice paragraphs, I would just time myself. I'd give myself 15 minutes. I'd look at my quote bank and I'd just write a paragraph for 15 minutes. Whatever I wrote, I'd hand it up to my teacher. Okay. Only 15 minutes of my night and I've already written a paragraph. Okay. You do that 3 times, you've got a whole essay. Okay. Now, memorization, I have the memory of a fish. Okay. I could not go into an exam and memorize a whole essay like a lot of students do. That is just not me. So it took a while for me to understand how I might want to tackle this, because I 100% wasn't going into an exam without knowing some parts of my essay. So I found that this was the easiest way to do it. I'd start with memorizing my topic sentences and my thesis statements. So basically just the first sentences of each paragraph. And then I would memorize my quotes. Okay. When I was memorizing my quotes, instead of saying them out loud, I would always write them. Because I found that there's no point of learning how to say them if you won't be able to speak in your exam. Okay. So just practice writing them as quick as you can, essentially. And after I memorized the quotes, I would do a mind map of the quotes. I would write the quote in the middle and I'd mind map the techniques and the analysis associated with it. Okay. So for example, I literally remember a quote from year 11 from Othello. And it's, "The green-eyed monster doth mock the meat it feeds on." Okay. Now that quote was talking about the theme of jealousy. I remember mind mapping jealousy. And then I wrote, it's a metaphor. Okay. And then it's personification, because green-eyed monster, they've personified jealousy. All right. So I mind mapped that. And after I had just like sat there and thought about the quote, I had about like 7 or 8 points sticking out of analysis and techniques from that one quote. Now, that being in my brain, I just going through the exam, I write down the memorized quote, and I've got all these ideas shooting out at me for what I could possibly write for the analysis. And that's how I did it for all my quotes. And it was easy. That honestly, I could do that. And I'm sure you guys can as well in a day. You can do that the night before even. All right. And you can always refer back to it. And you do that for each paragraph. You'll have around 3 to 4 quotes each paragraph. So you only need to do it around for 12 quotes. And I don't think that's that many. Okay. So that's one way to do it. And I found that when I walked into exam with memorizing, you know, the topic sentences and the evidence, everything just came, right? Everything, it was almost like it was writing itself, because it'd be like a flow-on effect. It'd be a domino effect. You remember one thing, you remember another. You remember one thing, you remember another. So that was pretty good. Another thing with memorization is learn the order of your quotes. Okay. So let's say you wrote a practice essay at home, but you're like, I don't have time to memorize this before the exam, let alone have the ability to memorize it before the exam. I would write out all my quotes per paragraph. So paragraph 1, quote 1, 2, 3, 4. Paragraph 2, quote 1, 2, 3. Paragraph 5, 1, 2, 3. And if you remember the order of your quotes, you know in which order your paragraph will be written, if that makes sense. So quote 1, I'll talk about this analysis. Quote 2, I'll talk about this analysis. Therefore, if you remember how many quotes are in each paragraph, you also won't be forgetting any quotes. So after I finish one paragraph, I'd be like, do I have 4 quotes? 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 4 quotes. Therefore, I have not missed a quote. And that helped a lot. So trial it. Remember, it's not going to work for everyone, but for someone who really struggled to memorize, that really helped me. Okay. Also, if you're a visual learner, use Quizlet. okay? Make pretty mind maps. But if you're more of a literal, like looking at words and memorizing that, I would advise that maybe you can write things in different colors. So write it in a different pen color, highlight it a different color, and it will help a lot. Awesome. So again, I just want to reiterate to everyone that study habits are different, and what works for you and what works for a friend may not work for you, okay? Or you're like vice versa, okay? But that being said, it's important to trial different study methods, and starting now is probably the best time, because you don't want to start year 12 and, you know, have basically flunked your first exam because you weren't prepared, because you didn't study enough or you didn't find the right study habit. So find one that suits you the best. I don't know if you guys know this, but there's something called the Pomodoro technique, which is basically, I think it's a timer for 25 minutes. And then after 25 minutes, you get a 5-minute break, okay? You can download little extensions onto your Google Chrome, which you can add on, or you can search up like tomato timer on YouTube or in the internet and it will pop up. And basically in those 25 minutes, I would challenge myself to either write a paragraph, handwritten, obviously. I would challenge myself to memorize my quotes within 25 minutes. And if I didn't complete it, it was fine. I just take a 5-minute break and then I do another 25 minutes. I find studying like that, giving yourself 25-minute sections and then a 5-minute break works a whole lot better than you forcing yourself to sit down for like 6 hours and try to study, okay? I would use a tomato timer, and because I was getting such frequent breaks, it almost felt like I wasn't studying. Like it didn't feel like a chore. And I would, at the end of the day, have done 10 25-minute rounds, which is like what, 250 minutes? That's like really good, okay? So think about that. Another one that I think that a lot of people use is this specific memorization one, where you kind of you like do it in different colors, and then it's like active recall. I'm pretty sure it's what it's called. And that's really good for learning your quotes, okay? And maybe even memorizing your topic sentences or analysis. So whatever works for you guys, go for it. But 100% trial and error is the main thing. And I definitely recommend the tomato timer Pomodoro technique. It works wonders. Okay, so just to finish up, if you guys are interested to book a free trial lesson in term 2, or if you have any friends that are interested, contact us through here. You can like take a note down of it, or you can like stay back and ask me any questions. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you gained something, at least one thing from the workshop. If you guys really are struggling with essays and you want any clarification with anything that I said today, or if I've confused you at all, or you want more in-depth answers into anything that I said, be sure to stay back. Don't be afraid to ask any questions. That's what I'm here for. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your holidays, which I know you only have 2 days left. But yeah, so I'll be here for the next, I want to say, like 10 or so minutes. So yeah, feel free to leave whenever. I also have the essay cheat sheet in like a PDF form. So if you guys would like that, just shoot me a message in chat and I can email that to you guys. And you can just print it out and have it stuck on your desk or something like that. But yeah, thank you for tuning in. I'm gonna stop this share now. If you have any questions, be sure to let me know. And don't be afraid to say it in front of everyone else, because something that someone asks may be a question that you didn't even think of.